There's a certain type of person you can recognize very early on. They are the kind of people who always try to make things clear, not because they are weak, a belief that many intelligent people carry with them from childhood. The belief is this: if people understand clearly enough, all conflicts will disappear. People like this often grow up with a deep respect for logic. They believe that truth has power, evidence has power, and if you can present your thoughts clearly enough, others will understand. So they do what seems most reasonable to them. They explain themselves. They explain their thoughts. They explain their intentions. They explain why they said what they could. They explain why they did what they did, not to control, not to manipulate, but simply to avoid being misunderstood. And for a while, this way of living seems to work. In school, in academic environments, in places where logic is valued. If you present the better argument, you win. If you have stronger evidence, people accept it. If you explain more clearly, misunderstandings are resolved. At least, that's what they think. But then they step outside of those environments, and they begin to notice something strange, something no one ever taught them, something many people take years to realize. There are people who hear everything you say, understand exactly what you mean, but still choose to misunderstand. At first, this confuses them. Maybe I didn't explain clearly enough. Maybe I need to be more detailed. Maybe I just need to be more patient. So they do what they have always done. They explain more. They repeat their point. They use examples. They clarify every detail. They try to remove every possible misunderstanding. But the strange thing is, the misunderstandings still happen. Sometimes, they even get worse. And that's the first moment when intelligent people begin to feel a very strange sensation, a feeling they have never experienced before. The feeling that logic does not always win, because in the real world, many conversations are not about truth. They revolve around ego. They revolve around power. They revolve around who is right and who must yield. But at this stage, they still don't realize that. They still believe the problem lies in how they communicate. They think that if they can just explain a little better, everything will be fine. So they continue doing what they have always done. They keep explaining and explaining and explaining until one day they realize a truth they had never considered before. A very simple truth, but also a very difficult one to accept. Not everyone wants to understand you. And when you realize that not everyone wants to understand you, an uncomfortable question begins to emerge. If people don't actually want to understand each other, what exactly are they doing in those conversations? We grow up with a very beautiful story about human beings, that humans are rational creatures, that when two people disagree, they simply need to talk, present evidence, analyze the logic, and eventually, truth will win. But modern psychology shows something completely different. Many studies show that when people hear a new idea, they don't ask, "Is this true?" Instead, they ask a different question, an unconscious question, a much faster question. Does this threaten my beliefs? If the answer is yes, the brain immediately activates a defense mechanism, not to search for truth, but to protect the ego. This phenomenon is called ego defense. And it happens more often than we think. When an idea makes someone feel wrong, defeated, or judged, their brain stops searching for truth. It starts searching for ways to fight back. That's why you can explain something very clearly, and the other person still resists, not because they don't understand, but because understanding it would mean admitting they were wrong. And for the ego, that's a very expensive price. Worse still, the human brain has a very strong bias. Confirmation bias. It means this: people don't search for neutral information. They search for information that makes them feel right. They remember things that support their beliefs and ignore the things that challenge them. So when you explain something during an argument, what the other person hears is not always what you said. They only hear the parts that fit the story already in their mind, and the rest gets discarded. That's why some arguments last for hours, but no one changes their mind. Two people are talking, but in reality, they are living in two different versions of reality. And this is the critical moment. The moment when many intelligent people begin to feel something deeply contradictory. They realize that the more they explain, the more tense the argument becomes, not because the logic is weak, but because the logic is threatening the other person's ego. And when that happens, the conversation stops being a search for truth. It becomes a psychological battle, a battle that most people don't even realize they are participating in. But that's only the surface layer. Because if you observe long enough, you begin to notice that in many conversations, logic was never the thing being exchanged. What is actually being exchanged is power. And when you begin to realize that what's actually being exchanged is power, every conversation starts to look very different. Before, you believed a debate was a place where two people searched for the truth together. Two different perspectives, two different arguments, and in the end, the better logic would win. But when you start paying closer attention, you begin to notice a pattern repeating itself. In many conversations, people aren't really arguing about ideas. They're arguing about position. Who's right? Who's wrong? Who has to give in? Who controls the narrative? Because in social dynamics, every time you admit you're wrong, you lose a small piece of psychological power. And for many people, that's harder to accept than discovering the truth. That's why there are debates where no matter how much evidence you present, the other person keeps resisting, not because they don't understand, but because admitting you're right means they lose. And this is where many intelligent people begin to make a very big mistake. They think that if they just explain more clearly, they can persuade the other person, so they start explaining in greater detail, adding more examples, laying out the logic step by step, trying to remove every gap in the argument. But what they don't realize is, every time they do this, they unintentionally change their position in the conversation. Because in social psychology, the person trying hardest to persuade is often perceived as the one with less power. Pay attention to this in everyday life. People who truly have power usually don't talk very much. They don't need to explain every decision. They don't need to convince everyone. Their certainty carries its own weight. Meanwhile, the person who keeps explaining often looks like they're justifying themselves, even when they're right, even when their argument is completely logical. And this creates a very uncomfortable paradox. The more you explain in order to be understood, the more you appear to be asking for permission to be accepted. That's why after some time, many intelligent people begin to feel exhausted, not because they've run out of ideas, not because they can't explain, but because they start realizing that many arguments were never about logic in the first place. They're about ego, they're about status, they're about psychological power. And once you've seen that long enough, a new question begins to appear, a question that completely changes the way you communicate with the world. If most people aren't actually searching for the truth, then does continuing to explain even make sense anymore? And then something else begins to reveal itself, something many people don't notice until they've experienced it for a long time. Explaining too much isn't just useless, it can actually weaken your position. In social psychology, there's a very interesting phenomenon. People don't only evaluate what you say, they also evaluate how much you need to say to defend it. If someone makes a statement and then stands quietly in their certainty, other people's brains often interpret that as confidence. But if someone says something and then spends 10 minutes explaining, justifying, and clarifying, the listener's brain may unconsciously interpret it in another way, not as, "This person is very logical," but as, "This person is trying to prove something." This is a very common psychological paradox. The more you explain, the more you appear to be on the defensive, even when you're right, even when you're simply trying to clarify. Because in the power dynamics of communication, the person who has to defend themselves is usually the one in the lower position. They have to prove, they have to persuade, they have to justify, while the person in the higher position rarely does any of that. They speak less, they don't explain every detail, and they don't feel the need to make everyone agree. This isn't always fair, but it's how social psychology often works. People don't just respond to logic. They respond to status signals, and explaining too much unintentionally sends a very specific signal. A signal that says, I need you to accept my point of view, while someone who is truly certain of themselves sends a different signal, a quieter signal, one that says, you can agree or not. It doesn't change the truth. Over time, intelligent people begin to realize this through experience. They realize there are arguments where no matter how much they say, the outcome never changes. The other person doesn't understand them better. The conversation doesn't become clearer. The only thing that changes is the amount of energy they lose. And that's when they begin to realize something important. Explaining doesn't just consume time. It consumes psychological energy. Every time you try to make someone understand something they don't want to understand, you're investing energy in a conversation with no end. You repeat your idea. You adjust your words. You try to find another way to say it, hoping that this time they'll understand. But the more you do that, the more a familiar feeling appears. Fatigue. Not intellectual fatigue, but psychological exhaustion. And when that exhaustion repeats itself enough times, a moment of realization begins to form. A very quiet moment, but a very powerful one. You begin to understand that not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Not everyone wants to understand you. And most importantly, not everyone deserves the energy of your explanation. And when that thought truly settles in your mind, a shift begins to happen. Not in what you know, but in how you respond to the world. Because from that moment on, you begin to do something you've never done before. You stop trying to be understood, and you start observing. And then, for many intelligent people, that moment finally arrives. It usually doesn't happen during a big argument. There's no drama, no victory. It happens in a very ordinary moment. A familiar conversation, a familiar misunderstanding, a familiar attempt to explain. You state your point clearly. You try to stay calm. You present your logic. You even try to put yourself in the other person's position. But then, you notice something, a small detail in the way they react. Maybe it's the way they interrupt you. Maybe it's the way they ignore what you just said. Maybe it's the way they repeat the same argument, even though you've already explained it. And in that moment, you begin to understand, not through logic, but through intuition. This person isn't really trying to understand you. They're just trying to defend their position. And once that thought appears, everything in the conversation begins to change. You stop trying to find the perfect words. You stop trying to clarify every detail. You stop trying to correct every misunderstanding. Not because you can't, but because you suddenly realize a very simple truth. You cannot explain something to someone who has already decided not to understand it. That's the moment many people describe as a kind of awakening. Not about other people, but about human nature. You begin to realize that. Some people ask questions not to learn, but to challenge. Some people argue not to find the truth, but to win. Some people pretend not to understand you, because understanding you would force them to give up the story they believe. And when you see this enough times, a psychological shift happens. A very subtle shift, but a powerful one. You start reacting less. You speak less. You no longer feel the need to fix every misunderstanding. You no longer feel the need to win every argument. Instead, you start doing something different, something you never really thought about before. You start observing. You observe how people react when they're challenged. You observe how ego appears in conversations. You observe who truly listens and who is simply waiting for their turn to speak. And from that place of observation, You begin to understand people much more deeply, because when you're no longer busy explaining yourself, you have time to notice something very clear. Most arguments are not exchanges of ideas, they are collisions. And when you realize that, a very strange calm begins to appear, not because you're indifferent, but because you've finally understood a simple rule of human communication. Not everyone deserves your explanation. And from that moment on, the way you show up in the world begins to change, not by speaking more, but by doing something you once never considered a strength: silence. And when you begin to realize that not everyone actually wants to understand you, a very quiet shift starts to happen. At first, you may not even notice it. You still take part in conversations. You still listen. You still speak. But something is different. You no longer feel obligated to correct every misunderstanding. Before, when someone misunderstood you, you immediately felt the need to clarify. You wanted to fix the story. You wanted to make sure people saw your true intentions. But now, that reaction begins to fade. Not because you've become cold, not because you don't care, but because you've learned something very important about human nature. True understanding does not come from you explaining more. It comes from the other person being willing to listen. And if that willingness doesn't exist, no amount of explanation can create it. So instead of trying to force understanding, you begin to do something you rarely did before. You observe people. You start noticing small details. Who is genuinely curious? Who simply wants to argue? Who listens? Who is only waiting for their turn to speak? You begin to realize that there are people who, the moment you say something they disagree with, immediately become defensive. Not because your idea is dangerous, but because it touches their ego. You also begin to notice that there are other people who, when they don't understand something, will ask more questions. They will think about it. They will consider it. And the difference between these two types of people becomes very clear. One type wants to understand. The other just wants to be right. And once you start seeing that difference, you stop trying to convince everyone. Instead, you begin choosing where to place your energy. You have deeper conversations with people who truly listen. You share less with people who only seek arguments. And you no longer feel the need to prove yourself to everyone around you. This is a very subtle change, but it completely changes the way you move through the world. You become calmer in arguments. You get pulled into fewer meaningless conflicts. And you begin to realize that there is a very unusual kind of power, one you never noticed before. A kind of power that doesn't come from speaking more, doesn't come from winning arguments, doesn't come from making people agree with you. It comes from something much simpler: the ability to not need to explain yourself to everyone. And when that shift fully settles within you, you begin to notice something interesting. Your silence starts to carry weight. Because when someone no longer feels the need to explain, it sends a very clear signal. A signal that the people around them can feel, even if they can't quite name it. It is the signal of certainty. And from that, another kind of power begins to appear, the power of silence. And when you begin to realize that not everything needs to be explained, a very strange kind of power begins to appear. It's not the power of winning an argument. It's not the power of speaking better. And it's not the power of making everyone agree with you. It's the power of not needing to convince everyone. When a person always feels the need to explain themselves, they often live in a constant state of defense. They keep adjusting their words. They keep clarifying their intentions. They keep trying to make sure other people understand who they really are. But when you stop doing that, something interesting happens. You begin to realize that silence is also a form of communication. When you don't react to every misunderstanding, you send a signal that says, the way you understand me does not control who I am. When you don't feel the need to correct every story people tell about you, you send another signal, your opinion does not define me. And when you stop trying to win every argument, you send an even stronger signal, I don't need this fight. In social psychology, certainty often shows up in how little a person feels the need to defend themselves. The more secure someone is about who they are, the less they feel the need to justify themselves. That's why truly confident people often speak less. Not because they lack ideas, but because they don't need to prove their existence. And when you reach that state, you begin to see the world in a very different way. You realize that not every misunderstanding is dangerous, not every judgment matters, not every story about you needs to be corrected, because the truth about you does not live in what people think. It lives in how you live. Over time, people begin to notice something about individuals like this. They don't talk too much. They don't argue over meaningless things. They don't explain themselves to everyone. But when they do speak, people listen, not because they speak louder, but because the silence before gave weight to their words. And that is the paradox many intelligent people eventually realize. Real power in communication does not come from saying more. It comes from knowing when nothing needs to be said. Because in a world where everyone is constantly trying to prove they're right, the person who doesn't feel the need to do that is often the strongest person in the room. And after all of that, after all the arguments, after all the attempts to explain, after all the times of being misunderstood, an intelligent person eventually learns a very simple lesson. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. When we are young, we often believe our reputation depends on people understanding us correctly. If someone misunderstands us, we feel the need to fix it. If someone says something untrue, we feel the need to respond. If someone judges us, we feel the need to justify ourselves. But over time, another truth becomes clearer. You cannot control the story people tell about you. Everyone sees the world through their own lens, their experiences, their fears, their beliefs. Which means, two people can look at the same action of yours and reach completely different conclusions. One person may see sincerity, another may see manipulation. One person may see confidence, another may see arrogance, and you can spend your entire life trying to correct every interpretation. Or you can accept a simpler truth. You don't live inside other people's minds. So over time, those who truly understand human nature begin to change how they see things. They stop asking, "How can I make everyone understand me?" Instead, they begin asking a different question, a more mature question, a calmer question. Who is actually worth explaining myself to? Because the truth is, there are people who will understand you even when you say very little. And there are also people who will never understand you, no matter how much you say. And when you accept that, life becomes much simpler. You stop trying to fix every misunderstanding. You stop trying to win every argument. You stop trying to prove yourself to everyone. Instead, you put your energy where it truly matters. People who genuinely listen, conversations that are truly deep, relationships that truly hold value. And when you live this way long enough, something interesting happens. You begin to realize that your silence is not withdrawal. It is selectivity. Not everyone deserves your clarity. Not everyone deserves your thoughts. Not everyone deserves your energy. And that is when you understand something many people take years to realize. Stopping the need to explain yourself is not a sign of weakness. Sometimes, it is the clearest sign of maturity.